All right, let's take our Bibles. Let's take our Bibles and return to the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 20. All right, let's start at verse 1. Revelation 20, verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. Then jump down to verse 7. When the 1,000 years were completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. All right. Today's question for this sermon is, why does God release Satan? Here, Satan is the chief source of horrible things that have been happening in this world for 6,000 years. And then in verse 1, an angel shows up and effortlessly just takes hold of Satan and throws him in prison. It says he lays hold of him, binds him, throws him, shuts him, and seals him in a pit. And boom, Satan's evil is done. It's so amazingly, seemingly effortless. It's like, why didn't we do this a long time ago? But there it is. And for the next 1,000 years, there's peace and joy and gladness and blessing all over the world because this one creature has been thrown into the abyss. But then verse 7 says that Satan is released to cause horrible things across the world again. And my question is, why? It isn't as if he escapes. God purposefully lets him out. In fact, it says in verse 3 that he must be released at the end of the 1,000 years. Today's question is, why will God release Satan when everything is going perfectly? And the answer to that question is an answer that will help you and I with the struggles that we face in life. We are, if you're committed to Christ today, we are the born-again saints of God, priests of God in this world who are going to reign with him forever and ever. But we struggle in this life, as the songs we've sung about this morning have shown. We struggle and struggle and struggle as we wait to get to that promised land. We are citizens of the kingdom, but we're not possessors of that kingdom yet. And the answer to why God releases Satan is the same answer to why we are going through hardships today. You are probably facing a hardship. If you're just like everybody else, there's a hardship, at least one, going on in your life. And if you could stand some help knowing how to respond the best way, listen to this sermon. It will help you to know the best way to respond to hardships as we answer this question from Revelation 20. So, let's ask, why does God release Satan from prison at the end of the millennium? Here's the answer. Do you want the answer? Here it is. This passage doesn't tell us. It doesn't. So let's close with prayer and no. This passage doesn't tell us, but we have other passages which shed light on why God allows this, and that's what we're going to look at. Look with me as I put on the screen here, Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 1. God is speaking, or rather Moses is speaking, God through Moses, to the Israelites before they enter the promised land. He says, here's what you do if this happens. Deuteronomy 13:1. If a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a miraculous sign or wonder, and if that sign or wonder of which he has spoken takes place, and he says, let us follow other gods, gods you have not known, and let us worship them, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. All right, here they're about to enter into the promised land, start this brand new life. Remember, they're in the desert. Now they're coming into the promised land. And he said to them, here's a case that you need to be prepared for. A man walks in among you, and he says, I'm a prophet. What do you do with him? Do you just totally accept what he says? He says, listen to me, I'm a prophet who's going to speak for God. We have that today, don't we? people show up and say, look, listen to me, I've got a message from God. What does God say to do? And not only what does God say to do, but in this case here, this man says, I'm a prophet sent from God, and then he performs a miracle. He says, I can make lightning come down to heaven. And so he puts up his hand, and lightning comes down from heaven. Well, what more convincing do we need than that? He claims to be a prophet from God, immediately follows it up by making lightning come from heaven. That's got to be the sign that he's real, right? Actually, that is one of the signs for what a real prophet is. He's going to tell them in chapter 18. He says, if what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. So how do you know if a man shows up, says, look, I interpret dreams, I'm a prophet of God, watch this miracle or this prediction, and it comes true and it really happens? That's one way to know the guy is real. But this is just one way to know he's real. Because not only do you examine the miracle that he does, if it comes true or not, you also examine the message, he says. Miracle and message have to be examined. In this case, what is this man in the previous verse saying? He says, let us go worship other gods. All right. So get this. Israel is about to head into the promised land. This is God's new nation on earth. God has chosen a nation to be, his people with his laws running everything, so that all the other nations of the world look at them and say, wow, we want to be like them and join them. So they're about to begin this new nation, and he says, there might come in a false prophet and try to get you to walk away from me. Now the question is, why would God even allow that for his people? They're his precious, special people. Why would he let a man come in and start speaking evil words about doing evil things? Why would he even allow that to happen? This passage does tell us why. This passage does tell us why. It says in Deuteronomy 13:3, the Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you will love him with all your heart and with all your soul. What is the greatest command that God has given all of us? To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. That's the greatest command. Let me ask you, are you doing that today? How do you know if you're doing that? You can say, well, I think I'm doing that. Am I doing that? I think so. How would you know? One way to know is if God tests you on that love. Does God test you on that love? In this case, what tool did God use to test Israel on whether or not they loved him? What tool does God use? He uses a false prophet. He lets this evil man walk into their nation and suggest evil ideas about leaving God when he could say, what? No, you're going to stop breathing right now. You're going to stop thinking right now. You're just going to lay down and die right now. These are my people. You're not going to have any evil influence on them. God lets this man walk right in to test Israel through that man. Will they listen to him and follow him? Or will they listen to him and reject what he has to say? God tests his people. That's the first point on your insert. In your insert, testing people is extremely important to God. Testing people is extremely important to God. Listen to Proverbs 17:3. The refining pot is for silver, and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests not silver or gold. He tests hearts. That's what God tests. Why are tests so important to God? There's two reasons. Number one, and this is in your insert, to reveal people's hearts. To reveal people's hearts. It's incredibly important to God that he tests us. Number one, to reveal our hearts, to reveal what's going on inside us. Testing. What do you think is the first time the word test is used in the Bible? The first test that God specifically says, this is a test for me. What do you think was that occasion? The first time it's used and described as a test, he may have done tests before this, but the first time he says, here is a test, is with Abraham. Genesis 22:1. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham. That's the first time that word's used. Take now your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. God's testing Abraham here, and what tool does he use? A command. A command. The command is a next to impossible command, isn't it? Abraham's going along just fine, and God says, I need to test this man's heart. So I give him a next to impossible command. Abraham had been doing very well before this. It looked by all outward appearances, he doesn't need to be tested. This man's heart is devoted to you, God. I mean, he shows up and he says, Abraham, look at the stars of the sky. Think of the sands of the seashore. I'm going to make your descendants like them one day. And it says Abraham believed God. And Romans tells us the moment he believed, he received God's righteousness into his account, so that when he stood before God someday, he would have the righteousness of God on his books as a person who's now right and at peace with God. And then a little later, remember, he's way too old to have children. She is way too old to give birth to children. And he believes God's promise. You're going to give me a son. And it says, in spite of that, all the evidence against this possibly happening, he believed. And God, again, has evidence. This man believes, but God says, I need to test his heart. In spite of all the good track record Abraham did, God says, I need to test his heart. And this is what this teaches us. Abraham's testing teaches us that we really don't know what's in our hearts until we are tested by God. And that's in your insert. Look in your insert. You don't really know what's really in your heart until you are tested. You don't really know. You remember Peter in the upper room. I am going to stand for you. I will die for you, Lord Jesus. But just hours later, the test came, and what was really in his heart? It wasn't to stand to the death for Jesus. Peter thought it was, but his test revealed that his heart was not as devoted as he thought it was. Testing is extremely important to God because it reveals the true condition of our hearts. And in Abraham's case, what did it reveal? It revealed in Genesis 22:12, the angel of the Lord called to him, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God. You don't really know what's really in your heart until you're tested. And God said, I need to test Abraham. And he tested him, and he passed the test and demonstrated that he had a genuine heart of devotion to God. Not like Peter, who said it, but it wasn't really there. Abraham said it, and it really was there. So 2 reasons why tests are extremely important to God. One is to reveal people's hearts. A second reason, and this is in your insert, is tests can remove impurities. Tests can remove impurities. Look at Malachi 3:3. It says, He, God, will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them. Refine, refine, refine. I understand that gold, when it's dug out of the earth, it's not like the gold you find in a jewelry store. It's full of all sorts of impurities and other metals and rocks and bits of other things that need to be removed. And how do you pick it all out? You make it really, really hot. And it becomes a liquid. And all those impurities rise to the surface, and then someone takes it and skims it off. And they keep heating it up and skim off whatever rises up. And they keep doing that and doing that and doing that until all the impurities are gone, and you're left with really pure gold. Each of us enters the Christian life with lots of impurities. And what is God's method? To purify us? Heat up our lives with tests. Heat up our lives with tests. Look at an example from Israel's history. Deuteronomy 8. Moses is saying, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years to humble you and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether you would or would not keep his commands. He humbled you causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. He led you through the vast and dreadful desert, that thirsty and waterless land, with its venomous snakes and scorpions, to humble and to test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. So why did God lead the Israelites through the desert? Number one, to reveal their hearts. Would they obey me like Abraham obeyed me? And number two, to purify their hearts, to purify them. Twice it says in these verses it was to humble you. That suggests that Israel's problem, one of the impurities they faced, was pride. We need to humble these people. Pride says, I'm higher and others lower. Look at me. I'm really high. Humility says, I'm lower and others are higher. God says, these people have a problem. They think of themselves really highly, much higher than they should think. So what am I going to do? I know. I'll put them out in the desert where there is hunger and thirst and snakes and scorpions, and I'll let them live there for a while. What do you think living out in the desert, where you're hungry and thirsty a great deal of the time, does to your pride? It tends to lower it. You really don't have what it takes to live there, and you can suddenly see, you know what? I'm not as high as I thought I was. And that's exactly why God did it. God let them be hungry and thirsty. And then when they cried out to him for help, he provided miraculous manna, miraculous water to show how high he was. We are low. You are high. Please help us. And there was a lesson learned. You don't just live by bread. You live by what comes out of my mouth. If I say you're going to live, you don't need bread. I'll provide bread. I'll provide water. It all comes from my mouth. That's the most important thing you need. And so all of this was done to lower their view of themselves and raise their view of God and do good for them in the end. That's why they were tested. Not to leave them in bad, but to bring them to good. Testing people is extremely important to God. Number one, to reveal their hearts, what's really going on in there. And number two, to purify their hearts so they become better and better. And in this case, it was pride. There are many different tools that God uses. Here he used desert and scorpions and snakes and thirst and hunger. Abraham, a command, a really, really hard command. What tool did God use in Job's life? Job 42, verse 11, says, after it's all over, it says, all Job's brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before his testing, that's what was going on in Job's life, came and ate with him in his house, and they comforted and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought on him. What testing did God bring to Job? It says here it's trouble. And specifically, what trouble? We know that he lost all of his possessions and wealth, lost all of his wealth, lost all of his children, and he nearly lost all of his health. That's trouble. That's trouble. And who does this verse say brought the troubles? God did. It says the Lord brought the troubles upon Job. But what tool did God use to bring Job his troubles? You remember the tool? Satan. Satan was the tool that God used in Job's life. It says in Job 1:12, the Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything Job has, is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. It says in Job 2:6 for the second round, the Lord said to Satan, very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. Each time God tested Job, he just simply released Satan into his life. It was like a mad dog on a chain, and he just let go. And Satan went in to attack Job with strict restrictions, strict limitations on what he could do. The first time, he couldn't hurt Job's body. Second time, he couldn't kill Job's body. But God released Satan into Job's life in order to test him with trouble. Now, is God guilty of doing evil here? Is that God doing evil? No. God is sinless. He doesn't do evil. Satan was bent on doing evil. And God, for all those years, had put a wall of protection, a hedge of protection around Job's life so that Satan couldn't get at him. He wanted to do evil. Couldn't get at him. That's what Satan's complaint to God. Yeah, you've surrounded him with this hedge of protection. I can't get him. No wonder he loves you and serves you. You don't let him experience anything bad. So God says, all right, I'll remove some of that wall of protection around Job's life. And he just let Satan go. God didn't cause Satan to go after him. God just said, all right, Satan, you can have permission to do certain things to Job. God did not sin. Job was sinned upon by Satan himself. This has been called the sinless use of sinful acts. God's sinless use of sinful acts. This is seen in the life of Joseph in the Old Testament, when his brothers were bent upon selling him as a slave to Egypt. That's a sinful act. Did God cause them to sell their brother into Egypt? No, they were going to do that all on their own. God could have stopped them with the wall of protection around Joseph and said, you're not touching Joseph, but God lifted that protection and let their sinful acts take place. But why? It wasn't to destroy Joseph. It was to do good for him in the end. As he said, God meant it for good. You meant it for evil, my brothers, but God meant it for good. That's a sinless use of sinful acts, and God does that all the time. The greatest example of that is Jesus dying on the cross. The Pharisees were bent on killing Jesus. Did God cause them to kill Jesus? Absolutely not. But God lifted his protection from Jesus when the Pharisees wanted and were bent on killing him. But what? It was all done for good, to do good in the end. It was the sinless use of sinful acts to accomplish good in the end. And that's what God often does, and it's what God did in the life of Job. So testing people is extremely important to God. It reveals hearts, and he has many tools that he uses. He uses really hard commands, as in Abraham's case. He used this really hard circumstances, as in Israel going through the desert. But in Job's case, he used an evildoer, Satan himself. The evildoer in the previous case was the prophet walking into Israel, right? And now he uses Satan himself to test his people. That then brings us all the way back to our beginning question. We're asking the question, why, at the end of the millennium, does God release Satan upon the world when everything is going perfectly? Well, remember the big picture. Jesus has come back. He's now to reign on the world for 1,000 years. At the very beginning, Satan is thrown into the abyss so that everything can go peaceful and joyful for 1,000 years. And now what takes place during that 1,000 years? Those of us who are in the church age will have glorified bodies, but those who survived the tribulation in their natural bodies, remember that? They're going to go in and they're going to start having kids. And their kids are going to start having kids. And the kids and kids and kids, kids and kids. Remember, death is going to be extremely rare in the millennium, and people are going to live extremely long lives. And that means the potential for populating the earth is going to be incredible. In fact, what does it say at the end of the verses we read this morning? How many people are on the earth by this time? You remember that? It says it's like the sand of the seashore. That's just a word picture of saying there's going to be a lot of people on the earth. I actually got curious and I Googled it and I said, what number is a sand on the seashore? And Google said, if you take a 3-foot cube of sand, okay, 3 foot, and it's just average sand, there's coarser or finer grains, but average sand. You know how many grains of sand are in that 3 cubic feet? 70 billion. 70 billion in this? Yeah. So what's on a seashore? That's a lot more than, there's 7 billion, by the way, on the earth today. So we will take this, according to our little rule that we're using, if the natural sense doesn't make sense, it's the symbolic sense. We'll take that as symbolic, because that's a lot of people. I don't know how the earth could stand that many people. So I think God is just trying to say here, it's going to be an enormous amount of people. Billions and billions of people are going to be on the earth by the time at the end of the millennium. And what are they all going to have in common? All the people who were born during the millennium will have one thing in common. You know what it is? None of them have ever been tested much. I mean, what has gone wrong during the millennium? Hardly anything. All these people, and they won't have hardly been tested even by the slightest thing. And what is coming after the millennium? Well, God says he's going to take everybody off the earth, remake the world, burn it with fire, remake it into a brand new place, put everyone back, and then we're going to go into eternity with Christ on the throne and the New Jerusalem, everything just into eternity, everyone loving Jesus Christ. But what about those who were born during the millennium? They've never been tested. How do we know what's in their hearts? They've been raised. Remember, every person is going to be going up to Jerusalem during the millennium to worship Jesus there at his throne. So all these people who were born will have gone every year looking right at Jesus, right there. He is on the throne. Was their worship sincere, or were they just going along? How do you know? You don't really know what's in a person's heart until they're tested. And I believe that's why Satan's released. This passage does not specifically say why Satan is released, that he must be released. But I think it makes absolute sense, knowing what we know about the rest of the Bible, that these people needed to be tested to reveal their hearts, to show, are they just going through the motions, or are they truly devoted to God? Just like Job, he releases Satan upon them. And what is Satan bent on doing more than any other thing? Deceiving. He's the father of lies. And the first thing he does is he runs to the nations of the world from every corner of the earth, and he lies to them. And he says, basically, let's go defeat Jesus. Jesus can be defeated. Come on, rule your own life. Do you really want to be controlled by Jesus? For this 1,000 years that you've been here, he's been the one in charge. He's the one in control. Don't you want to rule your own life? Isn't that exactly what he said to Eve? Eve, he's telling you not to eat of that tree, but rule your own life. Why let him be in control? Do what you want to do. Isn't that what Satan himself did? I don't want God ruling over me, controlling me. I want to rule my own life. He got kicked out of heaven. And Eve, she believed his lie. Didn't want God to rule over her and rejected his command. That's what Satan's going to do now to all these nations that have not been tested. Come on, we can defeat God. We can defeat Jesus on the throne. Let's go rule our own lives. And so billions of people, it says, are going to listen to him and believe him, because that test will reveal that their hearts were never devoted to Jesus. What was in their hearts? God tested them by allowing Satan to walk in, tell his lies, and those who were not devoted to Jesus will say, okay, let's do it. And they choose to wage war against him. And the rest of this chapter talks about how it ends in their complete destruction. But there will certainly be billions of others who are tested, hear Satan's lie, and say, no, we are remaining loyal to our King. We love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and we're not going to join you in your rebellion. And these ones then will enter the new earth and reign with Jesus Christ into eternity, because they passed the test that their hearts were devoted to Jesus Christ. So now it comes down to you and me. You and me. Testing people is extremely important to God. And are you this morning being tested? If you're going through a trouble, it's very possible you're viewing it as just a random, stupid, dumb thing that's happening. It's very likely that God has said, nope, I need to test you. I need to see what's in your heart, and I want to refine you, because I test my people so that they become better and better and better. If you are like most people and you've got a problem, think about a problem that you have. If you're like most people and you have a problem like that, you're probably trying to fix the problem, to fix the circumstances. So your furnace breaks down, got to fix the furnace. That's the point of this. Listen, the point of God's tests is not for us to change our circumstances. It's to change us. That's in your insert. Testing is God's bringing your impurities to the surface so you can see them and change yourself. That's what testing is all about. It's not so you can say, okay, I've got this problem with my car engine. What do I got to do? I got to fix the car engine. No, God says that's a secondary thing that you're supposed to do. First of all, you're supposed to look at your life. I'm being tested. What is my heart? How is my heart responding to this? What's really deep down in there? And like Peter, you might say, whoa, I thought I was really devoted to God, and I'm not as devoted as I thought I was. Because our real self comes up when we're tested. Right? Anyone can act on good behavior when things are going smooth. Let's throw in a problem. And suddenly you see what's really going on inside your heart. Sometimes we get sick, and we suddenly, because of the seriousness of the illness, become full of fear. What's going to happen next? Am I going to die? Is this going to be something that's going to be here for the rest of my life? And you fear and you panic. Well, fear and panic is not part of your new nature that God has given you. That's your old flesh. The fruit of the Spirit is peace and joy and self-control, not losing it in panic. So if you see fear in your life today, that's some of the impurities that God is allowing to boil to the surface so that you can skim them off and change your life. Don't just focus on changing the circumstance. Look and see, do I need to change something about myself through this test that's going on? You want to look at your reaction. If you're having a money problem, you want to look at your reaction. And if your reaction is revealing that maybe you have been materialistic, you need to deal with that. Maybe you've been spending money with a self-first attitude and buying things you really can't afford or you shouldn't be buying, and as a result, you're hurting financially. If God's revealed that to your mind, if He allowed that financial crunch to bring that to the surface, then skim that off. Kill selfish materialism in your life and put a God-first spending of your money in its place. Maybe a test is with a relationship problem you have with somebody, and as you're dealing with this, you hear yourself saying bitter things about the person. That's you bringing to the surface the impurity of unforgiveness. Listen to that. God's letting you see what's in your heart, and that's very helpful, because now you can say, whoa, I got to deal with that. And you kill unforgiveness and bitterness, and you choose forgiving them from the heart, letting them off the hook for what they did, being kind to them in response, being gentle and loving to them in response instead of bitter. God loves to test us because He knows it can improve us and purify us by revealing to us what we need to see. So the first question you want to ask yourself is not how can I fix the problem, but do I see something I need to fix about myself through this? Always let a hardship you're going through focus you on yourself first. How am I responding to this? If you see yourself responding well, great. But if you see yourself responding badly, that's a good opportunity to change yourself. First, look at what you need to change about yourself and then your circumstances. When we were tested in school, remember that? When you were in school? What did you think of tests? Most of us hated tests. Why? Because we didn't know the answers. When you are tested by God, however, you always know the answer. You know that? You always know the right answer when you're tested by God. The right answer in every test that you get is obedience. Now, you may not know exactly what form of obedience that takes, but that's always the answer to God's test. Add obedience to your test, and you'll pass the test. Just add obedience. For Abraham, what was it? Add the obedience of sacrificing your son. For Eve, what was obedience? Just don't eat of that tree. For those millennium-born people, what's obedience? Just reject Satan's suggestion and remain loyal to God. Just add obedience and you will pass the test. What is obedience for your trouble today? What is the right thing to do? Does God want, is it a moral thing, like you need to forgive or you need to, be kind to a person, or is it a practical thing, like God wants you obeying by seeking godly counsel, searching the scriptures, praying more, resisting Satan's involvement in your life, trusting God more? What is the right response to your situation with the obedient response? Add obedience and you will pass the test. Eve did not respond with obedience to her test, did she? And she failed the test and plunged everything into trouble. Abraham did add obedience to his test, and he passed. And he became known as the friend of God. Someone asked me recently if God is pleased if we obey and our emotions are not in it. You know, you're doing the right thing, but your emotions just aren't feeling it. Is that still acceptable to God? Well, we know Jesus' emotions about going to the cross, right? They were not in it. He has to escape the cross. Job's emotions were certainly filled with agony over what he was going through. Abraham's emotions, I can't imagine, were positive about sacrificing his only son. And yet each of these individuals did it anyway. And I think that's even more precious to God. I mean, when you are motivated emotionally to obey God, like praying for a sick loved one, that's good. That pleases God. But when you don't find yourself motivated to do an act of obedience, but you do it anyway, you throw aside your emotions and say, I'm going to do it anyway, I think that's more precious to God because it's harder to do. So why will God release Satan upon the world when everything is going perfectly? I think it's the same reason why God releases trouble and problems and evil people and even Satan himself upon us today. Because it's very important that you and I be tested to reveal what's in our heart and then purify the wrong that's been revealed. It would be so great if God would simply zap impurities out of us. Wouldn't that be nice? Just, hey, you've got an impatience problem. There, it's gone. God says, no, I'll give you a test so that you can correct it through my power, correcting it and becoming more pure and more pure and more pure. What is God testing you on today? It can be any range of things. God wants you to respond to that test by adding obedience to it. What's the obedient thing to do? And if you've been doing the disobedient things, confess that and turn from it and kill it every time it tries to get back into the door. Just slam the door on it and let obedience in. And keep obeying, obeying, and obeying, and sometime that test will end. All these tests we've talked about had a beginning and an ending. There will be an ending to your test. Just every moment of every day, kill disobedience and add obedience, add obedience, add obedience. And what's going to happen? In the end, you're going to find yourself more and more purified, greater and greater and greater purity. God loves you and he will test you, but he'll provide the strength for you to obey him every single time. Make sure you're doing that.